Hi, everyone in cyberspace. This is Russ Cohen talking to you. This is a pre-recording of the presentation I'm going to be making at the National Native Seed Conference. And I am glad to have made this pre-recording for you, whether or not you were able to attend that program in person or not. I hope this recording is useful to you. So let's begin. So I'd like to acknowledge that where I'm talking to you from in this pre-recording is outside of Boston in the town of Arlington, Massachusetts. Its traditional Massachusetts tribe name was Menotomy, and I am in fact in the homeland of the Massachusetts tribe. So I'd like to acknowledge that. But there's a special additional acknowledgement that a talk like this needs to do because of its content, and that is a knowledge acknowledgement and a plant acknowledgement. So let's start with the knowledge acknowledgement. I recognize that where this talk is focused on native species, these are species that, and the edibility of species, that information was figured out by the indigenous people that inhabited this region for thousands of years before anyone of European extraction like me showed up. And boy, am I grateful for all that knowledge that they acquired in that intimate connection with those plants for all those years. So my talk today is very much informed by that. And also the fact that many of the plants in our midst, in wherever we are, to a large degree, is shaped by indigenous activity over the landscape over thousands of years through trade or other means. Indigenous people moved plants to places where they wanted them to grow. And so the quote unquote native ranges of many of our species were expanded considerably through trade and other means to have these plants available for the indigenous people of those regions to have a bond with them, to use them for food or medicine or cultural activities, building materials, whatever. And so I'm grateful for that, for the presence of the plants in our landscape, and for advice on how to approach plants that you're interacting with in the wild. I can't think of a better source than this book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, one of my all-time favorite books. And in this book, she points out that the concepts of forbearance and restraint are fundamental to Native American teachings and interactions with plants. So it isn't not only knowing what is edible, medicinal, building materials, whatnot, but also when not to pick it. And so, as you may know, in Braiding Sweetgrass, there's a chapter called The Honorable Harvest, where she gets into this in detail, includes these principles in there. And I liken this list that Robin has shared in this book as more or less the 10 commandments of foraging. And it would be wonderful to have, as Robin suggests, that people put this like on a laminated card and take it with them in the woods as they're thinking about how to interact with plants and what protocol and process they should use as they do them. So I'll be definitely talking about this. So yeah, with native plants, wild populations of native plants, it is important when you're gathering for them for food or whatever reason that you do deploy some forbearance and restraint, just to make sure that you're not upsetting the ecological balance in any way, because as you know, native plants often have important roles for insects, other animals that rely upon them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So it's important to make sure that we don't degrade that important role these plants have for those fellow organisms we share the world with. All right, and another person who probably is responsible more than anyone else for getting people to focus on native plants and their ecological significance is this guy, Doug Tallamy. So when I do talks to lay audiences and I ask, how many of the audience have you ever heard of Doug Tallamy? I would say at least half the hands go up in a typical public talk I give of people that have never heard of him. So the way that I describe him is I say, as Bill McKibben has been so fundamental to being a prophet of sorts to get us to pay attention to climate change and our need to deal with it, that's what Doug is doing for native plants. And as many of you in this audience know, Doug's an entomologist in the University of Delaware, and he made a very astute observation a number of years ago where he saw that as our cherished migratory songbirds returned from their winter migration areas and fly back up to our area, and the birds pair up, they build their nests, they lay their eggs, and the eggs hatch, and the little babies are clamoring for food. What are the parent birds feeding them? They're feeding them caterpillars. And where are they finding those caterpillars? They're finding them on the native plants. And why is that? It's because native plants and caterpillars have co-evolved with each other. And so when a bird finds itself in a place where there are no native plants, it's like a food desert. They're not finding the caterpillars to feed their babies. So that's his point, very eloquent one. We have to plant native plants if we care about the food web and our birds, and basically the structure that enables all life to happen, including human life too. So as that word is getting out, this book right here, I'll just point out, Nature's Best Hope, Doug says, that's all of us. And he is very much focused in people making the change to the landscape in their individual yards, like converting a lawn to native landscaping. So as the word is getting out about the importance of planting native plants, lots of different folks are getting into the act, which is great. So you have states and towns and nonprofit organizations all promoting native plants, and this is wonderful. All right, now I need to tell you a story about a talk I went to on this subject, and this is going back about a decade ago. So this was at a conference called the Ecological Landscape Association Conference, which happened in Massachusetts, and there was this wonderful woman there, Kate Venturini, who gave a presentation on what she does in Rhode Island. And she was meeting with homeowners that live along the shore of Narragansett Bay and trying to convince them to put native plants in their yards to help absorb pollutants running off the parking lots and the lawns and stuff like that, and intercept them before they get to the water to help keep Narragansett Bay clean. Really important objective. And so I said to, so this chart I have up here in the screen, this is a chart that was in Kate's talk, a chart that should be very familiar to all of you, where you have the name of the plant on the left, and then you have all these columns talking about various attributes that these plants have, like they grow tall, they grow short, they like sun, they like shade. So I went up to Kate at the end of her talk and I said, Kate, where's your edibility column? And she said, oh, we don't talk about that. And I said, why not? And she said, we don't want people to eat these plants. We want them to leave them for the wildlife. And I said, oh, that's interesting. You have blueberry on your list. Are you suggesting that people plant blueberries and then never go out and pick a blueberry themselves? Oh, we wouldn't do that. So I said, why don't you tell them what else is edible then? And now they do. In Rhode Island, their list has an edibility column, which is great. And here is the point of this talk. The fact that many of our native species are edible by people too provides an additional powerful reason for people to plant them that might be insufficiently induced to do so on the pure ecological argument alone. So pardon me while I dwell on stereotypes for a second. In my mind, I imagine husband, wife, married couple on a lot, good-sized lot, and with a house there. And the wife has heard Doug Tallamy's talk, or she's read one Doug Tallamy's books, and she says to the husband, you know, it's really important. We got to plant native plants. It's really important. And the husband says, I like the yard the way it is. I don't want to change anything. And that's when she could bring him to one of my talks and learn about the edible native species. It's the what's in it for me angle. And my argument is, whatever your reason is for wanting people to plant native plants, you know, whatever your outcome that you're hoping to achieve, whether it's to help the birds or the insects or whatever it is, I would think that whatever motivation that gets people to do it is something that you ought to deploy in your effort to convince people to do it. So that's what this talk is about today, is to extol the comestible virtues of many of our native species as a way of encouraging people to put them in. All right. So, how do you know if a plant is native? Well, in New England, where I'm talking to you from, we've got a wonderful resource called Go Botany. It's a website maintained by the Native Plant Trust, and there is a page for every member of the vascular plants that grow wild in New England. So if you look at the shade here, and here is the 6 New England states, and you see the black lines, those are the county boundary lines. And if a county is colored in green, that means that species is deemed to be native to that county. And if this color were pink, then that species would be deemed to not be native to that county. So there's a good place to know, whether a species you're considering for putting in your yard is actually considered to be native in the place where you are. And as you know, another big issue for a lot of people is ecotype. Not only do you want to put a native plant in, but you want that plant to be from seed from that area, from plants from that area. And I have heard arguments on both sides of the issue. I think reasonable minds can differ on this issue, but I think one thing that can be said for local ecotype plants, I think it is fair to say that their chances of doing well in the place where you put them in, if the seed is from there, if the plants are raised there, is greater just because that plant should have some natural adaptation to doing well in the place where you're planting it. So that's for sure. Okay, so where do you get native seed? Of course, that's the whole point of this conference, but one place that just regular people can get native seed is from an organization that's participating in this conference, one I work with a lot, and I'm glad to see involved in National Native Seed Conference, and that's the Wild Seed Project based in Maine. And their focus isn't on edibility, although they very much recognize as an organization the edibility card and play it to say, hey, if you want native and edible, we've got some seed for you. And here's 5 species on their current list of seed they have available that are edible and native. All right, and another thing, to go back to the Native Plant Trust, another thing that's very useful to people is this tool they have on their site, where you can basically just put in the parameters of your site, whatever conditions you have, and then the computer will spit out a list of species that meet your qualifications. So if you've got a dry site, you put that in, or a shady site, whatever your parameters in, or whatever other attributes you want. So I thought, just out of the sake of curiosity, I would check the edible box and see what happened. And I got 80 results from that. There's actually more than 180 species native to Northeast ecosystems that are edible by people, but 80 is a pretty good representative sample. So then I clicked on sweet fern to see what would pop up, and there's the information page on sweet fern with its range and more details about the kind of habitat it likes. So this is really useful to people that need further guidance on, okay, what's going to work in my yard? It's a great source to go to. All right, and you'll see that that's the focus of the talk, the text I have at the bottom of this slide here. But before we get there, I'm just going to fill you in about what I've been doing. So since I retired from the Mass Fish and Game Department, where I worked on rivers for almost 30 years, and I retired in 2015, as an expression of gratitude to Mother Nature for putting all these wonderful things that I've been foraging on since the 1970s, because I've been teaching people about edible wild plants and mushrooms and foraging for them myself for 50 years now. And so I wanted to give back. It's also an important indigenous concept, is how do you return the gift that all these wonderful wild plants give us in terms of everything they do. But in my case, I'm focusing on edibility, and that is to propagate them and plant them. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for native edible plants. So I have set up a nursery outside of Boston, not far from where I live, where I am propagating over 1,000 plants, many of which I grew from seed that I gathered myself. And then I work out arrangements with cities and towns, state and federal agencies, tribal groups and tribal members, organic farms, and others to plant plants in my nursery in appropriate places in their properties. And I've done over 24 projects so far since I've been at this. So I'll get into more detail of the projects in a little while. But first, I want to talk about specific plants that I'm growing in my nursery and share a few stories about that. Oh, I forgot about this. So here is a compilation I put together, and this list now contains about 190 species of native plants, plants that are native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people. And this information is online. If you have any trouble tracking it down, let me know. My email's at the end of this talk, and I'm happy to point you to it. All right, so I forgot. I got more details about how I do what I'm doing before I get into exact plants. So here's my stratification fridge. It doesn't look like this now. It's a lot neater than the mess that it looks like in these photos. But the concept is, as you know, many of our native seeds want to go through an extensive cold period before they'll come out of dormancy. And so most of my seed goes into the stratification fridge. And then I'll keep it stored there, and I mostly sow things outside, although occasionally, as you'll see examples in my show, there's sometimes when I have to sow it inside, and I'll get to that in just a second. So yes, so when the cold weather comes, I like to cover up all my flats with blankets of leaves to help insulate them from the cold. And then in a normal winter, when we have reliable snow cover, you'll see a scene like this where everything gets nicely insulated with the snow. This year was not such a winter. We had a large period in January when it was quite warm, and then we had a really sharp cold snap without any snow protection whatsoever. So I'll find out in a few weeks as my plants begin to come out of dormancy if any of them got frostbite. Hope not. Okay, and then I do grow some things inside, especially for seeds that are precocious, seeds that start sprouting in storage, and those I need to sow right away or else they'll die. Yeah, and there's other examples of me growing things inside. And then here's a shot of my nursery. Here's another shot of my nursery. So this is just, a small window of the many, many plants I have in various stages of growth as they get big enough to start planting on some of the sites that I'm working with. Okay, so now we finally get to species to talk about. So here's the wild strawberry, and I like to start with this one in this show because this is a species that just about everybody has room for in their yard, especially if they've any kind of a lawn whatsoever. They can diversify their lawn with wild strawberries because these plants don't mind getting mowed, they don't mind getting stepped on, and the white flowers are popular with the pollinators, and the little strawberries, although they're teeny, admittedly, they are delectable, so they're fun to nibble on too. You can also make tea from strawberry leaves when the leaves are fresh or thoroughly dried. Apparently, when they're wilted, they're slightly toxic, but fresh or thoroughly dried is fine. And the tea you make from the leaves does taste at least vaguely like the fruit, and it does have vitamin C in it. So if you felt a case of scurvy coming on, you could rush out and make yourself some wild strawberry leaf tea. All right, and when I have extra seed to share, I'm happy to do that. So here is a photo I took from a prep school in Western Mass called Miss Hall's School, and they had a greenhouse on campus. And so I brought them some wild strawberry seed, and you can see they just took these clamshells like what you'd buy regular strawberries in from the supermarket, and they put the growing medium in there, and they put the seeds in there, and then they closed the lid and stuck it in a nice sunny, warm spot, and the plants germinated, did very well. And my understanding is that those plants got big enough that they could sell them along with the little broccoli plants and the tomato plants and the other things they were growing at their spring plant sale. So that was great. And I think that anybody, any organic farmer, anybody that's growing little seedlings to sell to backyard gardeners should think about diversifying into native species, especially ones that are so compatible with the habitats that are already there, like wild strawberries going into lawns. All right, so here is milkweed. And of course, this species has an important ecological story I'll get to in just a second. Let me say that it's only the common milkweed that's edible by people. Of course, all species in the Asclepias genus are important to the monarch butterflies, but this is the one people can eat. And I call it a procrastinating forager's dream food because there's at least 4 edible stages to this plant, and they happen chronologically in succession. So if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage shows up. So this happens to be edible stage number 3, when the flower buds are in nice tight green clusters, as these are here, you boil them for 7 minutes. In fact, that's the cooking method I suggest for all parts of the milkweed you're going to eat, is to boil it for 7 minutes. And they will not shrink or get mushy on you, the milkweed part you've cooked up, even after all that boiling. So for example, here in the bowl on the right side are milkweed buds that have been boiled for 7 minutes. And look how well they held up. If anything, they look even nicer than they do attached to the plant out in the field. So now you could just eat these just plain as a side dish, or you can incorporate them into different dishes like this milkweed egg puff. That is a recipe from my book, which I'll talk about at the end of the talk. Okay, and even the pods are edible when they're up to an inch long. If you boil them for 7 minutes, the flavor and texture is very similar to green beans. Okay, but here is the monarch butterfly caterpillar to remind us how important this plant is for butterflies. And I certainly would not want to be doing anything directly or indirectly that's going to reduce the number of milkweed plants in the environment, to make sure that there's lots around for the monarchs to find and lay their eggs on, and the caterpillars to eat, and so on. So when I give talks about this plant, I encourage people in the fall, as they're traveling around and they see an old field with the ripe milkweed pods split open with the parachuting business showing, just grab a couple of those pods, and as they're traveling around and they see some good milkweed habitat, like the edge of a school ball field or a bike path, something like that, that don't have any milkweeds growing there, just release their parachutes and help start a new colony. But let me show you what I'm doing in my own yard. So there is my house, and here on the edge of my driveway is our blueberry bushes, straight species, low bush blueberries, but amongst them we've allowed these Asclepias syriaca plants to grow, and the caterpillars have found them, and I'll show you that in just a second. But let me say, okay, if I want to make sure that these plants are available for the monarchs, what do? I go to a site called Journey North, which, as you may know, is a citizen science project where they track the northward migration of monarch butterflies every year. And it's kind of like a rash spreading from south to north on a map of North America. And you just keep an eye on that and check it periodically. And then once you see that the little plotted dots have reached Massachusetts, then I know, okay, I have to leave the plants alone and leave them for the monarchs at that stage. But anyway, in the meantime, I could be eating these plants. But yes, so the monarchs have found the plants along our driveway. And we know this for sure because one year we found this chrysalis attached to our garage door. Unfortunately, it attached on a hinge. So when the door went up and down, the chrysalis just went for a ride up and down. And there it was for 2 weeks, until one morning we went out and it was empty because the butterfly had metamorphosed and flown away. So yeah, I love to talk about the example of walking the walk on your own property, in addition to whatever supporting of native plants you do elsewhere. Okay, so this is a plant most of you know because it grows throughout most of North America. So this is the genus Amelanchier, many common names: shadbush, serviceberry, juneberry, and so on. And if you want to spot it in the wild, the best time to do it is in the spring, because it's an early bloomer. It blooms before, like, apple trees, for example. So it really stands out. And then you go back to that spot where you see the plants blooming, and in southern New England, where I'm talking to you from, that would be late June. But in northern New England, where this plant grows, it should really be called more Julyberry rather than Juneberry. So anyway, this is what it looks like when the fruit is ripe. And it looks a lot like blueberries, but it really doesn't taste at all like blueberries. It tastes like a cross between cherries and almonds, because the juneberries are in the rose family, as are cherries and almonds. So there's a family resemblance there in the flavor. And it is very common for juneberry plants. And by the way, there are over a dozen species of Amelanchier, and they tend to hybridize, so they're kind of hard to tell apart. But all the fruit is edible on all of them, so you don't really need to key it down to species to know that it's safe to eat. And yes, the songbirds really love these berries too, and it's pretty common when you go out to pick them that there'll be songbirds in the branches also eating the fruit. But the typical shadbush bush is like 12 or more feet tall. And so I think in the usual situation, there's plenty of fruit to share. And so you can be picking some of the fruit from the lower branches, and the birds can be eating the fruit from the upper branches, and there's plenty to go around. You can all pick out and have a great time. So Juneberries are great for stuffing your face right by the tree, or you can incorporate them into different dishes. So in my book, I've got a recipe for Juneberry muffins, where you can use fresh Juneberries, dried Juneberries, or frozen Juneberries. It works fine either way. So, and then you can also make strudel from them. And now, as you may know, Amelanchier, so members of that genus, they are one of the most frequently planted native species in parks and other landscaped areas, probably because they bloom early, and that's considered an attribute, and certainly is for pollinators. So, so sometimes the best place to collect seed is not from the wild, for the scale I'm working on is the retirement project scale, where I don't have to worry too much about provenance and stuff like that. I'll go to a park. So here is a park just a very short distance from my office in downtown Boston, where our state parks agency put in dozens of the Juneberry bushes. And so I could pick quarts on my lunch hour, and I would eat a lot of these fruit, but I would save some and extract the seeds from them, and then grow plants from the seed. So here's how I did it. Oh, there's the Juneberry strudel. Sorry, I did mention that one. Okay, so you eat the pulp of the fruit, and then you spit the seeds into your hand, and then you put the seeds into a plastic bag, and you can add a little vermiculite if you want. The seed should be slightly damp, and then you keep them stored until you're ready to plant them, or the seeds are ready for you to plant them. And so that often happens. My experience is with plants in the rose family, the Rosaceae, they seem to get precocious, the ones that I store in the cold moist stratification. Yeah, so these Juneberry seeds started sprouting, and this was in the middle of winter, so I could not sow them outside. I had to sow them inside. In a place that gets some light is good, or you can use a grow lamp if you need to. And so here are the plants getting bigger. They're now moved out to my nursery now that the weather got nice, and they're fine, once, so they can definitely winter over. I find Juneberries to be very hardy plants. I haven't had to protect them as much from the really cold temps as some other species. They seem to be able to take it. So now the plants that I started from seed I gathered from fruits I picked in a park are now 3 feet tall. And I think next year I'll start to see blooming on these plants as I begin to move them out and deploy them in the landscape. All right, so here is arguably our most attractive member of the rubus genus. This is flowering raspberry. So those of you from Michigan or from the West Coast might know a close cousin of this plant that has white flowers, and that would be called thimbleberry. But here in New England, it has these gorgeous magenta flowers, and the same type of very large maple-like leaves, and also the canes don't have any thorns. So this is one I say to homeowners, wouldn't this be worth considering for planting, even if you never ate it, just to look at it, because it's such a visually pretty plant. And I understand from folks that specialize in knowing the needs of our native wild bees, bumblebees, and other bees around here, that this is a good food plant for them. So another reason why you might want to plant it. So there's the main edible part on the flowering raspberry. Now, I will admit that these berries are a little on the dry side. They're not quite as yummy as just a straight, juicy red raspberry, but they're definitely worth eating if you have them. Now, let me tell you a seed collection story. So a number of years ago, I was cross-country skiing in New Hampshire, in Guilford, New Hampshire, right near Lake Winnipesaukee. And I'm going up along a trail near a brook, and I see a plant that I've recognized as flowering raspberry. And I saw the dried fruit just dangling from the plant. And I said to myself, I've got a seed collection opportunity. So I said to my wife, just hold on a second. I'm going to gather some of the seed. It was really cold, so she was getting a little impatient. So I gathered the seed, brought it home, and then the next winter I sowed it. And by the next spring, I had these wonderful plants that had grown from seed I gathered in the middle of winter while I was cross-country skiing. So that's a fun story. Okay, so now elderberries. Now this is the on the East Coast, we'd call this the common elderberry. Now some people call it Sambucus canadensis. Some people call it Sambucus nigra, variation canadensis. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, it's the one that has flat top clusters of white flowers and flat top clusters of berries. So it's different from the red-berried elder, which I understand some indigenous people figured out how to eat, but from what I understand of that species, most people don't consider it edible. This one, though, is definitely edible. Now, you can gather the flowers and make a drink from the flowers. There's an alcoholic version. There's a non-alcoholic version. It sort of ferments when you make it. But I tend to leave the flowers on the plant to wait for the fruit to show up, because you have to leave the flowers on the plant to get the fruit. So now I will just tell you, you folks already know this, but when I'm speaking to lay audiences, I use the elderberry plant as an example of a species to underscore the relationship our native plants often have with native insects. And I talk about this critter right here. Oops, I'm sorry. That's going to go to an internet slide that I do not want to have happen. Let's close that. Okay, I clicked in the wrong spot on the slide. Okay, how about, oh no, I don't want to do that again. I want to do this. There we go. Elderberry borer beetle. So this beautiful insect spends a good part of its life associated with elderberry plants. So the adult beetles mate on the elderberry plant. The female lay their eggs on the elderberry plant. The larvae live inside the elderberry plant. And now they're not hurting the plants. The plants and the beetles have co-evolved over eons, so they're in dynamic equilibrium, no problem there. But the common elderberry is a plant. I've heard a little bit of hyperventilating going on in the chef and the foodie world. And so I'm concerned about potentially wild populations of it getting picked a little bit too vigorously, unsustainably, and that wouldn't kill the beetle directly, of course, but if these plants began to have trouble reproducing in the wild, because all the flowers are picked off the plants and they weren't allowed to form ripe berries, then eventually, if we started to lose the plants in the environment, this beetle would lose its habitat. So that's a point I like to make to people. My concerns about when wild plants become articles of commerce, and whether that's for the wild food, which has suddenly gotten very popular in some of the trendy restaurants, or for medicines. It's been a while now since herbalists are quite concerned about the over-gathering of some native species from the wild and are trying to take measures to curtail that. So, so I'd like to just talk about this relationship as a way of kind of making the point to people about why they need to use forbearance and restraint when they're gathering native plants from the wild. Oh, I've clicked the web page again. I should just deactivate that so it doesn't happen again. Pardon me, will I just wait to turn this off? Okay, sorry about that. Let's get out of here. Okay, so there's the ripe elderberries, and this photo isn't upside down. That's what the berry clusters do from the weight of the fruit when they're ripe. And I understand you can get a stomach ache if you eat a lot of raw elderberries, but if you cook them first or you dry them first, you can eat all you want. I like to mix elderberries and apples together. So like elderberry apple sauce, elderberry apple pie is more interesting than just plain applesauce or apple pie. And you can grow elderberries from seed, and I've done that in my nursery. I've started them indoors, but you don't have to do that. You could absolutely start them outdoors. And you sow them in a little pot like this, and then they start to get big, and then the roots start coming out the bottom. And those of you that grow plants know that that's a sign that your plants are starting to get a little pot bound and you need to do something with it. Now, you could just dump everything out on the table and just prick out the small plants, or you could just procrastinate and take everything in the smaller pot and just move it all to a larger pot and let the plants get bigger before you give them their own pots or plant them out in nature. Either way is fine. Okay, so this plant, I hope you know, this is wild bergamot. This is a plant that is very important to our at-risk species of the wild bumblebees that have the long tongues, because that's the morphology you need to have to access the goodies in these flowers. And it's also a plant that has a long heritage and continued use by Native American tribes. The one I'm most familiar with is the Stockbridge Munsee band of the Mohican tribe, which is out in Wisconsin. I learned from one of their indigenous herbalists that this plant is so popular with the tribal members that they call it number 6 for some mysterious reason, but everybody uses it for a host of different ailments. But I'm talking to you about it today because it's edible, and this happens to be a savory mint. So the flavor resembles oregano. So you could use it as you'd use oregano in soups, omelets, casseroles, pizza topping, sausage making, something like that. Okay, and here's a plant that makes a good beverage. This is sweet goldenrod Solidago odora, native to eastern part of the country, not northern New England, but southern New England and further south and west. And it's a goldenrod that has a licorice flavor, so it's really fun. It happens to be one of the native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era when they were boycotting the British tea. And it's also, I understand from the folks that are concerned about planting plants for pollinators, there's another plant that's important to pollinators. It's also exceedingly easy to grow. And I found this when, just by accident, I noticed that some of my sweet goldenrod plants I had purchased and went to seed were producing sweet goldenrod plants that very same year. So that's an easy plant to grow. Okay, now there are birch trees that are edible. All birch trees can be tapped for sap. And here we have the black or yellow birch trees that have oil of wintergreen in the inner bark of the trees. And you can just peel the twigs and put the peeled twigs and peelings in a jar full of water. Just let it sit around for water. The water can be room temperature, and you have this delicious wintergreen flavored beverage. Now, you can also tap all birch trees for sap as long as the trees are big enough. And you use the same process that you'd use to tap a maple tree, and the birch sap starts flowing about 2 weeks after the maple stops. So in this area, that'll probably be like the end of March, beginning of April. Now, unfortunately, though, the birch sap is even waterier than maple sap, and you have to boil the heck out of it to get anything. And what you eventually get doesn't have the oil of wintergreen flavor at all. It looks and tastes just like molasses. So, I mean, molasses is great, but you're not going to save any time or money making your own molasses from birch sap. Having said that, if let's say you were camping during the time of the year when the birch sap was flowing and you were concerned about the potability of the water supplies of the place where you're camping, is you could get all the pure, clean drinking water you needed that way from tapping the birch trees. Okay, and it is fun to gather birch seed and to plant it. So a great time to do it is in the middle of winter time, right after a snowfall. The strobles you'll see here, so that's the structure that holds the seed. They will continue to release seed through the winter, and the seed will just be on the surface of the snow, and you can pick it off and then sow it on the surface of your growing medium because the seeds need light to germinate. And then your plants start growing. So I must have at least 3 dozen birch seedlings in my nursery that grew exactly this way. Yeah, there's some of them right there. Okay, so in my coastal talks I give in New England, I ask people what this is, and occasionally somebody knows, and sometimes I have to give an additional hint. Look at this boardwalk going over a dune. Does that help you? And then usually somebody in the audience says, oh, that's beach plum. And that's when I tell them that in terms of locating wild beach plum plants in the wild, the best time to do it is not when the fruit is ripe. It's in the spring when the plants are blooming. And this would be true for you out there that aren't interested in eating the fruit. You just want to collect the seed from it, and you want to know, where are these plants I could collect seed from? Use the same technique. Look for the plants in May, see where they're blooming, remember where they are, and then go back. Labor Day weekend, that's the right time, at least in New England, to look for them and look for the right fruit. Because there's the right fruit. It's usually purple. There's another color I'm going to show you in just a second, usually purple. And I find beach plums vary in flavor from bush to bush. Sometimes they're a little on the puckery to astringent side. They'd still make good jam or jelly, but sometimes the beach plums are really yummy, just about as good as any conventional plum that you'd grow yourself or buy at the store. They are on the smaller side. Beach plums are about the size of cherries, but they're still really good. And they do not you do not have to live right along the coast to plant them, as long as you have a sunny, well-drained spot. And actually, the soil should be rather poor. This is a species that has evolved to grow in sand dunes, so it doesn't need a rich, loamy soil. In fact, I understand it doesn't do well if the soil is too nutritious. So, yeah, so if you've got like an old gravel pit, sunny area like that, I think beach plums would be worth a try. And yes, beach plum jam is a wonderful thing to make from them. And you can go a little further and make baked goods like these rula, which I love to make, and they're very good as well. Okay, so here is the yellowy orange version of a beach plum. As far as I know, it's a variety. It's the same species, it's just a variety. And so I'm doing an experiment in my nursery right now where I've saved the pits from this fruit and I'm propagating plants from those pits. And I want to see if the fruit eventually produced from those plants have the same color. I think they should. I'm just waiting to see if I get a confirmation on that. So this is a good example to talk to you about another member of the rose family, in this case, the Prunus genus, where once again, I see precocious sprouting. So whether it's the purple ones, the orange ones, very typical for me to see stored seed start sprouting in the fridge, in the dark, in the little plastic bags where I'm storing the seed. And so when that happens, you have to sow it right away. And then, indoors, because the plants are too tender to sow outdoors. And then when the weather gets nice, you can move them outdoors. And so I have beach plums in my nursery now that are big enough to be producing fruit, blooming and producing fruit that started just like this as little babies from seed, from pits, from fruit that I gathered from the wild. Okay, so here's a story that just happened. So I went out and picked some of those orange colored beach plums, and I stored the pits in cold, moist stratification, just a little vermiculite in the pits. And this was in 2018 and 2019. And those pits just sat there until 3 weeks ago when they decided to sprout. And why on 2 bags collected almost exactly a year apart did they decide simultaneously to sprout in the dark? I have no clue. But anyway, so I've now sown them indoors because it's still too cold up here to move them outside. And then I'll move them outside when the weather gets nicer. So if anybody in the audience has any explanations for why this seed germinated in the dark in the little plastic bags years after I collected it, I'd love to know. Okay, so spice bush, a native species that's quite common in southern New England because it's a species that deer aren't keen on eating. And so there is some understory areas, especially under hardwood trees where the soil is rocky and where there's a perennial intermittent stream. Very common to see a lot of spice bush plants there in southern New England. And this is another of our native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era. They just steep the twigs in hot water. I will collect these berries and dry them. And when you dry them, they lose that beautiful red color. They get this dark red color and they get kind of wrinkled. But after you dry them, you can put them in a little jar in your pantry and they'll keep for years without going rancid. And then I'll just grind up a few with a mortar and pestle to get a savory spice like black pepper, Szechuan peppercorn. So once again, good for soups, omelets, casseroles, stuff like that. Now, having said that, whoops, let me go back. Sorry about that. Let me go back. Okay. This berry is an important food for songbirds because it's high in lipids and the birds know that. And so they'll seek out these berries to fatten up and fuel them for their southward migration. So I tell everyone that I teach this plant to that if you're gathering any berries in the wild, it's really important to leave lots of berries on the plant so the birds get all they need. Okay, now if you do grow spice bush in your yard, or you're observing it in the wild, you may run into this cool critter called the spice bush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. And as we know, lots of Lepidoptera do similar things, but I'm just telling this story in the context of this particular species that's on this plant. So after the egg hatches, this first early instar here, so this caterpillar is about 1/2 an inch long. It looks just like bird poop, and that's an ingenious disguise. No birds are going to eat it at that stage. And then later on, it morphs like that. These are fake eyes. The real eyes are down here. So this caterpillar is trying to impersonate a snake. And so that works. And then even at the pupa stage, you see it looks just like a dried leaf. So isn't it amazing, these ingenious disguises that this organism has evolved to not get eaten? And you can grow spice bush from seed. This is, I think the technical term is recalcitrant. This is seed that you cannot allow to dry out. So like the ones I showed you that I dried out for spice, none of those seeds are viable anymore. You have to allow them to stay moist. And so I will collect the berries like that. Just keep them in a plastic bag at room temperature, like on top of my fridge for a while until this fruit pulp rots off. And then I'll finish cleaning it off, and then I'll store these seeds in a little plastic bag with a little vermiculite in my stratification fridge and just wait until they sprout, and then I sow them. And this is also really important. So in my nursery, I use a lot of this 1/2 inch mesh hardware cloth, and I cover up most of my flats with it, even stuff like sweet goldenrod, because I find that the curious, ravenous rodents will dig up everything just because they can. And so I learned from bitter experience what happened with this flat when I pulled off this hardware cloth, thinking, okay, the seed is sprouted, safe to go. Nope, the chipmunks had an inkling there might still be a portion of some seeds in there, and so they unearthed all of these plants to dig up the remaining seeds. So don't make my mistake. Leave the hardware cloth on there until the seed is completely used up. Okay, so there's a lot of sumac in the natural environment, and so you might feel like the world doesn't need any more sumac, but it is an exceedingly easy one to grow from seed, as I'll show you in just a second. It's also edible. Now, when I speak to lay audiences and they hear the word sumac, they immediately think of poison sumac, and a lot of them assume that the sumac they're familiar with, like this one, the staghorn sumac, that must be the species they've heard of as poison sumac. And then I gently point out to them that poison sumac berries don't look anything at all like this. That's what poison sumac berries look like. Very close similarity to poison ivy berries because they're closely related species in the Rus genus. And or toxicodendron, I guess it might be moved to. Anyway, so yes, any sumac with these upright clusters of red berries is not only not a poison sumac, but it's edible sumac. So that staghorn sumac and smooth sumac and winged sumac are the three you're most likely to run into around here. And the main way to eat them is you make a drink from the berries, and it's very easy to do this. So you gather the ripe fruit and you put it in a bowl of water, and you're just rubbing the berries in the water, and the flavor is getting off the berries into the water, and it turns this pinkish orange color. And then just get rid of the berries, take that liquid, pour it through any kind of a filter like a paper towel, and then what goes through, you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. I typically drink it cold and sweetened like pink lemonade. So there you go. There's the sumac drink. And the entire time it takes from picking the fruit off the plant to making the drink and drinking the drink is only about a half an hour. And all this text is just warning you not to put the spent sumac berries in your compost unless you want to be picking out sumac sprouts from your compost. I made the mistake 9 years ago. I have a feeling it's going to keep going on for a while longer. I just take the little babies, pot them up, and move them to my nursery. But you might get tired of picking out sumac plants out of your raised beds. So I probably would not compost those berries unless you want to be doing what I'm doing. Okay, so we've got several different species of wild grapes that grow in southern New England. They're all edible. This happens to be Vitis labrusca, which you often smell before you find the ripe grapes because they give off that wonderful grape aroma. And last year we had a drought around here, so it was harder to fill up baskets like this, but it is not hard at all in a typical season to fill up a basket like this in less than an hour of these wonderful grapes. And then they're delicious just plain, or you can make a beverage from them. I tend to puree them, and then I'll use the puree to make sorbet, or one year my wife made this grape cheesecake from them that was really good. And one of our other species is called Riverside grape, and it produces ripe grapes too, but they're not as yummy as the fox grape. But this is the grape species that a lot of people use to make the stuffed grape leaves, which you can use any grape species for. This is one that some people, so there are the stuffed grape leaves made from the Riverside grape. And yeah, and grapes are fairly easy to grow from seed, but my understanding is from my own personal experiences, you can't let the seeds dry out or they'll lose their viability. So the seeds I have gotten to grow in my nursery are seeds I did not let dry out. Okay, so here's one of our edible native trees. This is tupelo or black gum, and the fruit have this not very thick, but and quite sour, but perfectly edible flesh in the outside of the seed. And just this past January, I had some Nissa sylvatica jam that was made from that fruit pulp that was quite good. So, so yes, it's definitely edible. And that's what the seed looks like after you clean the outer part off. And so this is another one that I store the seed damp. Whether or not you have to do that, I can't say, but I just know that it works when I do it. So I store the seed like that, and then it will sprout in the bag, usually the following spring, about 6 months after I've picked it. And then you have to sow it indoors, and then you can move it outside. And so, yes, so once the cold weather is over, you move it outside and it could just stay outside, and you just, keep repotting the plants till they're big enough to put out in the landscape. Here's two other native species I grow from seed, the hackberry and the starry false Solomon seal. In both cases, I'm cold moist stratifying them. That's what CMS stands for. And then sowing the seed when it sprouts. Groundnut. So this is a native herbaceous vine where the edible part are the tubers, and you can obviously plant the plant from the tubers, but if you want to preserve the genetic diversity, then you'd want to sow it from seed. The seeds are somewhat hard to find, but I have found lots of them on occasion. And yeah, so there's the little beans inside the seed pods. And yeah, I have grown groundnut plants from those little beans there. And here's hog peanut. This is another herbaceous vine where the main subterranean part that's edible are these little peas. And these, as opposed to groundnut, are seasonal. These are only available during the off season, like from the end of September through the end of April. And other than that, they've sprouted and they form new plants. So, but there's also an above ground, teeny little like dollhouse size pod here, less than an inch long. So in there are the teeny little seeds, which you can sow and get into hog peanut plants. And there it is growing in my nursery. And hazelnuts are edible. Well, that we've got two different species of hazelnuts that grow wild here in southern New England. There's the common hazelnut. There's also the beaked hazelnut. And all this text is just telling you that for hazelnuts, and my understanding is just about all nut trees that grow around here, they're all hydrophilic. Basically, you cannot allow them to dry out or they'll lose their viability. So store them, if you're not sowing them right away after gathering ripe seed, store them in a fridge with some dampness in the bag. And then when you sow them, you have to protect them with that hardware cloth. Otherwise, the ravenous rodents will get them. Okay, and where I collect seed is underneath power lines, and I don't think it's the electromagnetic radiation. I think it's all the sun the plants are getting. And so I will seek permission when I can figure out who owns a piece of property that has some seed that I want to gather. And so here I got permission from the power company and the owner of the underlying land, which happened to be a town conservation commission. Permission from both of them to gather the seed here. And so I have many, many hazelnut plants in my nursery that I grew from seed that I gathered from the wild. It is not hard. And acorns, all acorns are edible, and all oak trees produce them, although not every year. There are mast years, there are on years and off years for oak trees. So you want to obviously look for seed during an on year. And the big difference in terms of propagation is that the acorns from what's called the white oak group, they tend to sprout soon after ripening, whereas the red oak group will stay dormant until the following spring. So you really can't store white oak acorns, at least in my opinion, because once the radicals come out like these have, and they start sprouting, they'll start to rot unless they're in the ground. So when you see sprouting on your white oak acorns, you really need to sow them. Okay, black walnut, that's native to much of the country, and you don't have to pick them off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground, and then they'll look like this. And you probably could sow a black walnut even with some of the rotted husk still on there. I just clean them off though. So like this, and so so here I want to make a distinction. If you are collecting black walnuts to eat them, you want them to dry out inside. And so once I get the husk off, I'll just ignore them for at least 2 months before I start cracking them open to get the nut meat, because you want the nuts to dry out inside the shell. Then they separate more easily from the shell. But if you want to propagate black walnuts from the nut, don't let the nuts dry out or they'll lose their viability. So this is a device I use to get black walnuts open. I got it from a company in Oklahoma, and it does a very excellent job with it. And then I use black walnuts in baking. So for my live talk I'm giving next Thursday, I will have this a handout about black walnuts that will have this recipe for the baklava in it. And then I intend to bring for the live program some forage snacks for people to try. And so I hope to bring a batch of these black walnut honey squares, which are quite good to share with folks. And shagbark hickory, this is my #1 favorite edible species, whether it's native or non-native. Now, the name hickory comes from pauca hickory, which was the traditional porridge that Native Americans make from the nuts. And this is a tree I'm always looking for in the landscape because it's got this shaggy bark to it. So it's not like a seasonal phenomenon. You just look for the bark, and then you start checking for the nuts from mid-September to late October. That's the time when they're ripe, and you don't have to pick these off the trees. Wait till they hit the ground. And then so in a typical season, I'm finding lots of nuts, and that's the four-parter husk that often this just falls off the nut once the impact of this falling on the ground. So here's a recipe for my book. This is a maple hickory nut pie. This is a New England version of pecan pie, and virtually everybody I feed this to say it's even better than pecan pie. And here are 3 different cookies I make from shagbark hickory nuts, and I intend to bring this one. So those of you that see the live talk, I think you're going to get this cookie on the right here, the triple maple hickory nut sandwich cookies, and you'll see how good they are. And yes, I grow a lot of shagbark hickories from seed. I collect thousands of seed every year, and I'm eating most of it, but hundreds and hundreds of the nuts I'm saving for propagating either by myself or for sharing for other people. And so they will sprout sometimes in the fridge, but if you want to accelerate the process in the spring, you just pull some out of the refrigerator and just keep them in the moist bag, but just at room temperature, and then they'll start to sprout, and then you can sow them. And I'm growing them in these tall tree pots. These are 14-inch tall pots because these little trees, even though in 1 year's worth of growing, they'll get only about 3 or 4 inches tall, the root below the surface of the ground can go down to the bottom of a 14-inch pot just in 1 season's worth of growing. So yeah, tall pots would be a good thing to grow them in. And I have partnered with other people on some of my projects. So this is Katie Featherston, who managed the greenhouse at Keene State College in southern New Hampshire. And I gave her a bunch of hickory nuts and other things, which she grew out, and then we planted them on a site. So now I'm going to start to talk about some of the sites where I've done some native edible planting. And this one is in Swansea, New Hampshire, and here's the planting plan for it. And so let me just go back. So the wonderful thing about this site is I had lots of experience working with volunteers to put in native plants. The bad thing is that the beavers came and flooded everything at the end, a year or 2 later after we did this installation. And so I go back to that site and I have a hard time finding any of the plants we put in. But that was a learning experience. So here, you don't have to read this. It's just a list of a few of the sites where I put in plants. Here's an example from Marblehead, Mass, where I planted some beach plums. And these slides just tell you where I put the plants in, how I decided where to go. I dug the holes. Then the volunteers helped me get the plants over at low tide. Then we put them in. And yes, they're still doing well, at least some of them. I made some other beginner mistakes in this project. Another coastal property, this is in Salem on property owned by the Essex National Heritage Area. I diversified that site with additional native species. Another coastal site south of Boston. Here's a paddle or access point along the Connecticut River where the Appalachian Mountain Club and our State Parks Agency partnered to establish these access sites. And they were very happy to have me put some of my edible native plants at the site so paddlers could nibble on them along with the other food they brought in with them. And there's another side of it. Here's a wonderful place to go in Western Mass, just a block away from a very busy village center, is this walk along the Housatonic River where they took a rubble-strewn eyesore covered with Japanese knotweed and they converted it into a native plant paradise And so I have contributed edible plants to that site that are doing very well. Here I planted marsh marigolds with Sarah along a brook down in the south coast of Massachusetts. So here's a site I did in Rhode Island where you can see all the plants we diversified that site with, including shagbark hickory. And the point of the photo on the right is to show you how we've deployed these cylinders of, once again, that half-inch mesh hardware cloth to prevent these plants from getting nibbled to death by rabbits or deer. And in some cases, it's really important to do that if you want to have plants. Here's the site in Lexington, Mass. that the town did where we took an area where they replaced a failed covert with a daylighted stream, and we planted that site. Here's the planting plan I drew up. Here's the consultants and the volunteers in the town that came together to put the plants in. So one thing I love to do is to go back and check and see if I guessed right in terms of putting a plant in a spot I thought it would do well. And here you can see I put in flowering raspberry, and it's really happy in this spot near the stream. And I feel like I can read this plant mind, and the plant is sending this message: Russ, thank me so much for planting me here. I'm really happy here. So here's a site from Maine where he put a bunch of plants, an Audubon Society site where he planted spikenard. It's doing really well. Here's a site, a permaculture site up in New Hampshire that is the richest site I know of for edible wild plants. It has over 90 species now. Now, a lot of those are weeds and invasives, but there's also a lot of native edible plants there, including plants I brought up from my nursery to further add to their already amazing total. So here I am doing some of that planting here. Here we've used cardboard mulch as a way of deterring the competition for the plants we're putting in, which I think is something that that native planters could also use. And here's the last site I have time to talk about today. So this is a Miyawaki forest project in a former landfill in Cambridge, Mass, where I donated a bunch of plants to the site, and there I am putting one in. And there's a view of it from the air. And with that, last slide is just sharing seed that I have with different folks interested in planting native plants here in the Boston area. And there's opportunities to do that. And with that, I've got 2 books I want to talk to you about, then I will be done for sure. So native plant agriculture, this book is from Cincinnati, and it's applicable to that area particularly, but has some relevance to anywhere. And this book just came out by Jared Rosenbaum. And this book is a book that I could have written, but Jared beat me to it and probably did a much better job than I would have done on it, to talk about more or less what I am doing, just diversifying sites with native plants. I'm focusing on edibility. He's looking at edibility and medicinal values, but in some case, plants have both. So we're both very interested in that. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much. Okay, so that would be the end of my talk that I would give in front of people that I'm going to give next week. And so I'd be taking questions at this point. So while you're still watching, let me just point out the fact that this book here, oh, you know, I don't see the record button. Did I not record any of that? I don't think I recorded any of that. So let's see, stop share. I'm stopping sharing. Ha ha ha. Boy, that's funny. I didn't record any of that. Okay, so now I know I can fix the show. All right, so let's end this show. End the show.